So warm welcome to everyone this evening. It's really nice to see so many familiar friends in the live Zoom room and also some new friends joining us. This is a special evening. Not only is it the start of our fall online programming at Mind and Life Europe, but this is a Mind and Life Europe Friends Talk, which is usually just reserved for the Mind and Life Friends community of subscribers. But this evening, we're opening it up to a wonderful partnership with an organization called Humanize, who also works with one of our association members, so Dr. Elena Antonova, who many of you know, either through MLE or through Humanize. And so we'll be hearing from Elena in just a moment. I would like to formally introduce her. But first, I just wanted to invite my colleague Franziska Schmidt just to say a couple of words to introduce herself and to say hello to people in the room. And she's our colleague from Humanize.
Hi, a warm welcome also from my side. I'm Franziska and based in Berlin. I'm the CEO of Humanize. And we actually are utilizing healthy technology to cultivate real connection between people through a partner-based mental practice. And for that, we developed a 9-week curriculum, and we're very happy that we have a scientific advisor board, that our program is rooted deeply in science, and we have over 20 wonderful teachers that went through our teacher training, and we're just so happy to connect with the Mind and Life Institute, and are here today co-hosting this webinar. So just a warm welcome also from our end. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Franziska. And thanks once again, everyone who's joining. I see some more familiar faces logging in. Really nice to see you all. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Dr. Elena Antonova, who will be giving the presentation this evening. And she is currently a reader or associate professor in psychology at Brunel University, London, which she joined in June of 2019. Prior to that, she was a lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience at King's College London, where she remains a visiting researcher. Elena's research focuses on the effects of long-term mindfulness practice using neuroimaging and psychophysiology methods with the application to the prevention and management of psychopathologies. She has been actively involved with the Mind and Life Institute since 2011 and Mind and Life Europe since 2013, and was elected a Mind and Life Research Fellow for her contribution to contemplative science in 2017. And importantly for this evening, Elena has had a personal meditation practice since 1998 and has attended numerous meditation retreats since 2001, mainly studying and practicing the Dzogchen approach. And so this evening, as many of you saw in the title of Elena's talk, Open Presence and Compassion, How Dyads Open Up the Space Between Us, you will probably hear some echoes of our banner theme at Mind and Life Europe this year, which is opening up the space between us. And so this was a nice moment of two worlds dovetailing so that we could bring that theme back out into the open, and also hear more specifically about some of the research behind dyadic practice, which Elena will share with us this evening. So without further ado, I'll pass the baton to you, Elena, and thanks so much for offering your time this evening.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I will share my slides. As it has been mentioned, my talk is about the intersection of open presence and compassion, or rather the two of them being two wings of the same bird. So in order for me to differentiate empathy and compassion, I will start by defining what is open presence. And as Joanna mentioned, I approach this talk not just as a neuroscience, but also a practitioner of open presence within the approach called Dzogchen in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And in terms of research, I'm presenting other people's work today, as my own research doesn't directly focus on empathy and compassion or dyadic work, but I will present some of the research that has been published recently using the dyads towards the end of my talk. So in order for me to arrive at open presence, I will need to draw the differences between how mindfulness is defined in the Buddhist tradition, sort of East, and how it reincarnated itself in secular West. I will talk about stages of mindfulness practice development in order to define what open presence is. And then we'll have a brief look at what open presence is in relation to different approaches to practicing mindfulness. And I will use this term non-dual mindfulness in relation to open presence. And then at the end, we're going to talk about distinguishing empathy and compassion and the relationship between open presence and compassion. So as a lot of the guests here, I'm sure, already know, mindfulness is a translation of the Pali word sati or smriti in Sanskrit. And in those languages, colloquially, just means memory, recollection. But when it's used in the context of meditation or contemplative practice, it's akin to cognitive psychology term working memory, keeping online what the meditation contemplation instructions are. So from the point of view of Buddhist contemplative practice, it doesn't really make sense to say this is mindfulness meditation and this is not mindfulness meditation. All practice requires mindfulness. It's just what it is that we're keeping guard of depends on the practice activity at hand. And for those interested in how mindfulness became defined in the way that we use it in secular mindfulness-based interventions, in the clinical research, in basic scientific research, this volume in contemporary Buddhism is very interesting. And it can become quite dizzy in trying to understand what mindfulness is, based on the contributions to this volume from the scholars of Theravada Buddhism, of Zen, of Tibetan Buddhism, clinical practitioners, neuroscientists. It seems to be mindfulness is a definitional minefield. So let's give a little bit more clarity how, at least for the purpose of this talk, we use it as secularly defined. So this gentleman, Thomas William Rice Davids, who was a British scholar of the Pali language, made the first entry into the Pali language. He introduced Theravada Buddhism to the West, and the entry in the Pali English dictionary, as you can see, has many other terms that actually precede the word mindfulness. Memory, recognition, consciousness, intentness of mind, wakefulness of mind, mindfulness, alertness, lucidity, and so on. So the strongest influence on John Kabat-Zinn, who started to use mindfulness in the context of his secular stress reduction, as it was originally called, program, he was very much influenced by Niponika Thera, who was a German-born Sri Lankan Theravada monk. And he spoke of mindfulness as bare attention. So what do we mean by bare attention, or what did he mean by bare attention? Normally, our attention comes in with all sorts of baggage attached to it, right? And it also doesn't have this sort of fluidity that we might experience in the state of flow. Wherever we have an intention to focus on something, we simultaneously fixate on the object of our attention, at least in our ordinary untrained attention. And in fact, the terms focus and fixation, they're used interchangeably, synonymously in cognitive neuroscience when studying visual perception, for example. But in the phenomenology of experienced mindfulness practitioners, those two are dissociable. And so with the practice, focus and fixation usually come together, but they become dissociated. And we might talk about mindfulness being experienced as a sort of flow state when there's a continuous flow of appearances, experiences through the field of awareness, rather than constant attention freeze frame type experience that we're all familiar with. And that's what is meant by mindful attention or bare attention, to differentiate it from attention as we know it. And so that bare attention is what John Kabat-Zinn means in that definition, that it has become well popularized, the top one, paying attention in a particular way, on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. But the fuller definition also includes the awareness that arises from this process of paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. And I kind of broke it down and color-coded it, and my apologies to anyone who has color blindness to red and green, but essentially we all have this ability for attention, even if it comes with habitual fixation to begin with. But as we apply it through the certain process, a purposeful present moment without judgment, reactivity, and so on, we arrive at the result, which is not the end goal. It's also a process of its own kind. But by result, in inverted commas here, we mean the quality of awareness, yeah, that which is an experience, or it is experienced as being distinct from our ordinary awareness. So that would be mindful awareness. And this result has many different names in Buddhism, but this is one of the important points of this slide. When we say mindfulness in secular tradition, it covers all of this, the ability, the process, and the result. So it can be tricky sometimes to pinpoint what exactly is being looked at or talked about. The sort of a triad of breaking down secular mindfulness echoes in Nipponic Terra's writing, and he talks about it as an ability, skill, and a result in a way, with the ability being the unfailing master key for knowing the mind, and thus its starting point, the perfected tool for shaping the mind, and thus the focal point, and the lofty manifestation that results in awareness achieved as freedom of mind, and thus the culminating point. So the operational definition, what we use for the purpose of investigation, then captures this twofold aspect. Is the self-regulation of attention, bare attention, and its adaptation of a particular orientation. Yeah, so attention in itself is not sufficient for it to be mindful attention and to lead to the emergence of the mindful awareness. We need this experiential rotation. So we don't fixate on the experiences, we don't judge them, we don't react to them, but we're aware of them in the field that has curiosity, openness, and acceptance to whatever appears within it, the field of our awareness. So what defines mindful attention and subsequently mindful awareness, it's not what it is, but how it is experienced. That matters. Let's look at the stages of mindfulness practice, so-called 4 foundations of mindfulness. And these are well described in the tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, and they present a core structure of mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. We usually start the practice of mindfulness with mindfulness of the object of some kind. It could be the body, it could be some external object, visual often, and so on. But it's some kind of what we consider as object of our appearances that we rest attention upon. And then we move to mindfulness of feelings and thoughts, mindfulness of mind states, so to speak, sleepiness, boredom, agitation, and so on. And then mindfulness of phenomena as a sort of non-preferential awareness of whatever appears within it without making any distinction or having any particular focal point. And Anton Lutz and colleagues presented this very helpful diagram in the 2007 chapter, which kind of summarizes these 4 foundations in terms of stage 1 of the practice is where this is using my terminology, working with fixation, habitual fixation on the objects. Whereas in the second stage, when we turning towards feelings and thoughts, we are learning to not to identify with meditating subject. Habitual tendency to identify with the object and subject, they also co-emerge. And as we loosen up both the identification on the object, or fixation on the object and identification on the subject, we naturally have this reflexive, what's here called reflexive awareness, revealing itself by the virtue of having loosened up the usual subject-object structure that shapes our cognition. And stage 4 denotes this kind of stability of resting in this reflexive awareness. So in 3, we're kind of getting the hang of it, glimpses every now and then, and stability to a certain extent. But at stage 4, it's our new default state. And so there are various terms used for the stages, and I'm not going to focus on them too much, but just take us to the point that at the beginning, we refer to those as kind of open monitoring. In the Buddhist tradition, shamatha with support, or shamatha with object, for those in the Zoom room who are familiar with the tradition. And so, as I've mentioned, learning to focus without fixation. I won't go too much into this and go straight to second stage, where, as I've mentioned, we're working with non-identification with the subject. And this is stage of mindfulness of feelings and thoughts. And in secular terms, it's also referred to open monitoring, but it's now subject orientated. Or in the tradition, it's shamatha without support. And so to this third stage, which is very subtle, open monitoring, in MBSR and MBCT, at the appropriate term might be choiceless awareness. But when we come to the 4th stage, that's when we start to talk about open presence, non-dual mindfulness, pure awareness. This stage and these terms do not explicitly articulate it within MBSR and MBCT, but who knows? The practice itself, and if we come from the point of view that this is a quality that is innate, or the awareness that is innate within us, it will reveal itself if one goes through the stages of the practice. So open presence and non-dual mindfulness, that sort of term non-dual mindfulness was coined by John Donne in the same volume of Contemporary Buddhism, in his paper called Towards Non-Dual Mindfulness. And in that paper, John draws parallels between Mahamudra of Tibetan Buddhism and mindfulness-based stress reduction, to make the point that this kind of effortless effort approach to practice, the practice of nature of mind, the practice of open presence, is what is intended by, or what was intended by John Kabat-Zinn in MBSR. So again, we're seeing these parallels between that approach and the approach within secular mindfulness as practice within mindfulness, core mindfulness-based interventions, MBSR and MBCT. And John also introduces 2 other terms in that paper: constructivist approach to practice and innatist approach to practice within Buddhism. And the non-dual notion that non-dual awareness, that non-dual mindfulness is our inborn, innate state that needs to be revealed rather than cultivated, and hence it's innatist, it's innate within us. It's a response of Zen and Tibetan Buddhism to a constructivist approach, which is practiced within Theravada, the school of elders, and it's very much goal-orientated. And in fact, we do need to have a subject aiming to get somewhere within a constructivist approach. So those distinctions are kind of important when we start looking at compassion, definition of compassion, and differentiating compassion, referential compassion with non-referential compassion. So effortless effort is important. Innatest attitude or innatest formulation is important. In what way? It gives us this understanding that it's not something we arrive at after many hours of practice, of effort and discipline. This is something that can be tapped into. The discipline and so-called effort are required to stabilize this once it's revealed, this non-dual awareness, but we can glimpse it at any point. It's available to us. And this is very important when we start talking about whether it's possible to even tap into compassion as an experience within the dyadic work without having practiced for 10,000 hours somewhere in a lovely Himalayan cave. And these are cartoons just to present the central point of we're already there, right? So it's just getting the hang of how to see the sun shining at any time. It shines on both sides, right? So how do you get to the other side? You're already there, but it's our fixations, identifications that obscure the sun. But even when we are having awareness obscured by our thoughts, fixation on our thoughts, fixations on our objective perceptions and so on, and identifications with the subject, it's still there and can be revealed to us if we manage to drop the fixation and drop the identification simultaneously. And as I said, they co-arise. And MBSR has this serenity prayer included in session 8 handout, which is the last session. And it gives us a clue here. So it's not explicitly articulated in the program, but it's implicit in the program. And I will read. If the so-called serenity prayer, we ask for the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things that should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish one from the other. Where do we find this grace, this courage, this wisdom? At some level, we already have all these qualities. Our task is to realize them, make them real, and our way is none other than moment by moment mindfulness. So again, coming back again and again to this point that it's our natural state. And we're seeing references to non-dual awareness in our Western philosophical tradition as well. Greek philosopher Pyrrho spoke of ataraxia, meaning non-perturbed, the state of lucid and calm awareness achieved through the process of epoche, or suspending, bracketing out our judgments, beliefs, and other mental structures, expectations, anticipations, presuppositions, and so on. And his student, Greek philosopher Epicurus, who is now famous for hedonism and hedonistic pleasures of physical type, actually he held ataraxia as the greatest pleasure a human can achieve. And German philosopher Edmund Husserl spoke of pure consciousness that you arrive at by applying the methods of epoche that Pyrrho has articulated, bracketing out. So this notions of it's given, it's pre-given, it's innate, it's just to be revealed are very much part of our Western tradition as well. And of course, it's there in physics. And I love this quote by Erwin Schrödinger: "The world is given to me only once, not not one existing and one perceived. Subject and object are only one. The barrier between them cannot be said to have broken down as a result of recent experience in the physical sciences, but this barrier doesn't exist. So non-duality of subject and object is something that we now bring when talking about differentiation of empathy and compassion. The definitions of empathy break it down in three important aspects: cognitive empathy, an accurate understanding of another state; affective empathy, a state of emotional contagion. So when we say we resonate with one another in terms of our emotional state, that would be a typical state of affective empathy, which often, more often than not, is tainted by personal distress. We tend to empathize with things or share things that we find challenging. And this can trigger our own experiences of similar types that then allow us to have this emotional resonance and can produce that self-orientated emotional response to diminish the discomfort, to diminish the personal distress. And personal distress has been shown over and over again in the social neuroscience and social psychology to diminish and inhibit altruistic action due to the self-protective orientation. Compassion is not very well defined, I would say. In the literature, it's often treated as either synonymous with sympathy or synonymous with empathy. It's sometimes put together with such terms as perspective taking, or in fact as emotional resonant state. So within social and affective neuroscience, again, a little bit like with mindfulness, it's a definitional minefield, but we will go by the Tibetan Buddhist definition of compassion. And this is a quotation from His Holiness Dalai Lama's book, The Ethics for the New Millennium. And he explains what the term ninje means in Tibetan language. I will read. As such, our innate capacity for empathy is the source of that most precious of all human qualities, which in Tibetan we call ninje. Now, while generally translated simply as compassion, the term ninje has a wealth of meaning that is difficult to convey succinctly, though the ideas it contains are universally understood. It connotes love, affection, kindness, gentleness, generosity of spirit, and warm-heartedness. It is also used as a term of both sympathy and of endearment. On the other hand, it doesn't imply pity, as the word compassion may. There is no sense of condescension. On the contrary, ninje denotes a feeling of connection with others, reflecting its origins in empathy. But it's also spoke about in the tradition as a process. So rather than being an emotional resonant state, it's a process of acknowledging the suffering of ourselves and others, understanding that suffering is a common experience, accepting the experience of suffering, and also compassion in Tibetan Buddhist definition necessitates action to reduce suffering, that is response, and not just a reaction to alleviate personal distress, often in the face of other people's suffering. It is also important to differentiate between referential and non-referential compassion. Referential means it's directed towards someone in distress, another sentient being, which would be the context of Dyads. And these are different sort of aspects, spontaneously changeable. So if someone is there, the referential compassion is there, but for non-referential compassion, it's a way of being, and therefore it doesn't require a referent. It's a It's almost like an affective state accompanying the state of open presence. The referential one has a concern of another suffering, where the non-referential comes from its understanding of common suffering. And it's an experiential understanding of common suffering, not just conceptual one. The referential one is directed towards an individual, and non-referential directed towards all sentient beings. There is no group of in-group, out-group. Is the suffering as universally experienced. Referential is based on the similarity with others. Again, there is self-other boundary there, and therefore self-other comparison. Whereas in non-referential, it's equality with others. It's based on the loosening or complete dissolution of the boundary between self and the other, as other being something different. Perspective taking is an aspect of referential compassion, whereas non-referential has that quality of immediate knowing and appreciation of others' conditions and limitations. It's almost difficult to know how one arrives at that understanding. It's just there by the virtue of the connection within the space of open presence. And referential expressed through care and concern, whereas non-referential is expression could be perceived as sometimes cruel, so-called crazy wisdom, knowing when it might be more appropriate to give someone tough love than a sugared pill. So this is, again, instances that can be found as descriptions of this non-referential compassion with tradition. I'm not necessarily implying this should be implemented in dyadic work, but it is just to make the point that sometimes the way it is presented could be observed very differently from the side. But if it really comes from the space of compassion within the state of open presence, it will be appropriately received. That's the distinction that I would like to make. And referential compassion inevitably, to some degree, will be blunted due to personal distress and that self-other distinction, whereas non-referential compassion has this incredible potency. It fully manifests as an expression of the non-dual mindfulness or open presence, non-dual awareness. This is just to make those distinctions of how the two can be practiced within the constructivist approach, which requires a sort of a cultivation process, called its cultivation path. Compassion, referential compassion, is practiced alongside mindfulness, sort of strengthening mindfulness and heartfulness in parallel. And the most common practice is loving kindness or metta. And I'm sure most of you, if not all, in the Zoom room are familiar with the practice of generating compassion for oneself, then extending it to someone helpful or friendly to us, with us, to someone neutral, then to someone we find challenging in our life, and then to all beings without exception. And when we extend it to all beings, we're already starting to get to the stage of non-referential compassion. But for the innatist, again, non-referential compassion is the other side of the coin of non-dual awareness. If one is truly resting in non-dual awareness or open presence, compassion is a fountain that spontaneously pours from the heart as an effective expression, emotional expression of open presence or non-dual awareness. And I referred to the two as two wings of the same bird at the beginning of the talk. So let's look now at the neural dynamics of empathy and compassion and how they differ. And here I will refer to work by Tanya Zinger and her colleagues. Tanya was at University College London at the time, and she conducted this pioneering study in affective neuroscience, essentially starting the research, neuroscientific research on empathy. And the design was very clever. There were couples, 16 couples that were romantically involved. And a woman of the couple was in the scanner. We have the stereotypical notion that women are more empathic than men, generally affectively empathic. And the partner was outside of the scanner. And as you can see, the woman could only, what was visible to her from within the scanner is her hand and her partner's hand. By the way, can you see my mouse here when I'm pointing here? Okay. And there were different conditions. There were electrical shocks. There were, even for high pain, they were quite mild, but the individual pain thresholds were established before the scanning session. And the shock was either administered to the partner or to the woman in the scanner. And there were low pain or high pain conditions. And not to bamboozle you too much with the different sites of activation that they're on the slides for those who would like to go to them later on. The main point to make is that there is a so-called pain matrix in the brain that comprises of areas that process sensory pain sensation. And this is somatosensory cortex. And there are areas that process affective pain response. Yeah, there's two areas of pain and suffering. And pain, as we know, is inevitable, but suffering is optional. But what was activated in women in response to the pain stimulation administered to their partner was the affective pain response, those neural dynamics of affective reaction to pain. So this paradigm was then used in other studies, and those networks were replicated. It's always important to have replications. So there is this dissociation between pain and suffering. So green areas are pain as sensation, somatosensory cortices, and red are those areas where we empathize with the pain in other by relating it to our own experience of suffering by that pain sensation. And interesting study by Cheng and colleagues looked at whether the same networks are associated for empathy for the loved one versus a stranger. And what they found is that although the networks were the same, you can see the blobs are in the same places, but they are somewhat more diminished in spread and strength of activation when we empathize for the pain of the stranger rather than someone loved by us. So those degrees of separation, at least in this study, have shown that this emotional contagion, this affective resonance on the neural level is different, depending on the closeness of the person to us. And another interesting finding in their study was that the inclusion of the other in the self, as measured by self-report questionnaire or scale, was correlated with activation in the temporoparietal junction. And we know the temporoparietal junction is where self-other boundaries processed. So that activation was weak or stronger in people who did not include self in the other, and vice versa. So there was an inverse correlation. So if there was less subjective self-other distinction, that was correlated with the activation in that area. So just to summarize the neural correlates of empathy, empathy for pain shares the network associated with the affective reaction to the pain sensations, and those are mainly in the areas called anterior insular and anterior cingulate cortex. And the extent to which this network is activated is greater when we empathize with someone close to us than someone we do not know. And this closeness effect is mediated by whether we include the other into self, and is associated with the relative activation of temporoparietal junction involved in self-other distinction. So now moving on to neural correlates of compassion. And this slide was kindly shared by Tanya. This is her doing sort of single case investigation to understand the difference in terms of neural dynamics. And I'm sure most of you recognize Mathieu Ricard, who is our favorite guinea pig when it comes to studying the effect of contemplative practice on the brain. Allegedly, he's been in the scanner more often than any other contemplative practitioner. And on this top panel here, what we see is the sort of what we call parametric activations in those areas of the brain, anterior insular, that I've mentioned before in relation to previous studies, that Mathieu could activate increasingly when he was asked to have an empathic response mixed with sort of personal distress, and therefore it's called empathic distress in relation to, I think it was sounds of suffering. And baby crying and so on. Whereas when Tanya asked him to then switch to compassion, and they didn't use, here we're looking, I forgot to mention, so-called neurofeedback or real-time fMRI. So you focus on a particular area, as it was known from previous research that Tanya's done. This is the area that was focused on, and indeed, these are the activations that were confirmed within the interoceptive cortex. But as it was not known at the time what compassion as a response would generate in terms of neurodynamics, the whole brain was scanned without looking at analysis in real time. So it's very computer intensive. And the brain images were analyzed afterwards, and much to the surprise of Tanya and other researchers, what Mathieu has activated were the areas associated with reward, dopaminergic areas, so-called substantia nigra, striatum, globus pallidus. It was quite puzzling for Tanya. Well, she knows Mathieu to be a very compassionate being. He's definitely not a social psychopath to rejoice and draw pleasure from the suffering of others. But Mathieu also explained that it is a positively affective state, as we spoke about. So this difference between resonating with the distress of another, becoming contained by the same often negative emotion when we empathize, it is staying in one's open presence, in one's compassionate connection to the other, whilst acknowledging the suffering, whilst being present to the suffering of the other. Yeah, so there is no blocking, but that there is a complete presence, what what is there, but at the same time, one's own affective state is that of love, essentially, rather than being a negative one tinged with personal distress. So I think, yes, I think it was a slide that I intended to delete, not to. Sorry, I will skip this one and go straight to the study that looked at differentiating empathy and compassion within the same population. The study was conducted by Olga Klimecki and under Tani's supervision in her lab at the time. And so the study design has involved the same group first undergoing empathy training and then compassion training using loving kindness or metta practice. This was compared to the control group that had to memorize poems at the same time points. And the socioaffective visual task was used. Sorry, I got to alter this slide from before, just not to give you too many unnecessary details here. But let me just quickly show you actually the paradigm. So the socioaffective video task required looking at static images, but also videos of high emotion and low emotion, and indicate empathy or compassion in response to those videos, and rate negative affect and positive affect. And this was for the previous study. So going back to the findings in this study, the important part to focus on is this on the right. Sorry, this one on the left. The subjective ratings to low emotions videos increase after empathy training, but the positive affect in response to both high and low emotion videos has only increased after compassion training. So those are the bars. So this is empathy training and compassion training. The memory group is in the green, and so as we can see, there are no changes here. No increase in a positive affect after empathy, but you can see there is a clear increase in positive affect after compassion. So this is a very important study that showed you can differentiate those two responses within 2 months in people who did not have previous meditation background. So it's one thing to show it in Mathieu, who has practiced for over 10,000 hours. Actually, I don't know how many hours, but way over what we consider to be an expert. So this is a neural differentiation of the two networks. And again, empathy is in blue, and these are the same areas that were found in meta-analysis study that I showed you earlier. And these mainly include somatosensory areas and anterior cingulate and insula. And the compassionate response mainly included the basal ganglia areas, those reward circuits. And there is some activation in orbitofrontal cortex as well, dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, which are areas relevant to self. And this could be because we're looking at loving kindness and also the beginner practitioners. If this study were to be conducted in more experienced practitioners, we might not see those sort of self-referential areas there if we're looking at non-referential compassion. We don't really have definitive study of neurodynamics of non-referential compassion using fMRI, but the study by Anton Lutz that was conducted when he was at Richard Davidson's laboratory. These were very experienced Dzogchen and Mahamudra practitioners from Tibetan tradition, called into Rich's lab on the invitations from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So we're looking at very, very experienced practitioners. And EEG was used, electroencephalogram was used in this case. And the frequency or wave bands that has shown definitive difference in meditators as compared to controls when they were resting in non-referential awareness in response to distressing sounds or sounds of suffering were gamma. And gamma is the highest frequency that our brain generates. So it seems to be related to non-referential compassion. And we also know that open presence produces high gamma. So again, this shows to us that open presence and non-referential compassion are two sides of the same coin. So we're seeing similar neural dynamics when it comes to gamma frequency. And this is a study that was published in 2023, looking directly at dyadic practice, boosting empathy and compassion, and comparing mindfulness-based training with socio-emotional dyadic practice. There was quite substantial sample size here. Pre-intervention, all participants were given a computer task and questionnaires to fill in, and then some have undergone socio-emotional training and some mindfulness-based training. And when they were assessed after the training, it was found that training-related increases in self-compassion were associated with differential processes. So mindfulness-based training improved empathic distress regulation. And we would expect that, improving non-reactivity and non-judgment, while socio-emotional dyadic training activated care and acceptance-based processes. And one would think that if both were administered, then both self-compassion and compassion for others would naturally emerge, with mindfulness as a foundation followed up by directing the non-judgment and non-reactivity towards the presence of another and sharing of another. So to put it all together, mindfulness is a secularly defined, echoes Buddhist traditions that emphasize effortless effort and belong to an innatist approach of realizing non-dual mindfulness or non-dual awareness. The terms empathy and compassion are often used interchangeably in affective neuroscience in reference to affective aspect of empathic response. In Buddhism, compassion is a multi-layered concept with different schools having different approaches to cultivating and generating compassion. And this is important when we approach it. If we approach it from the point of effort, and it might take 10,000 hours, it might actually impede our ability to tap into experience of compassion as a way of relating to another from the space of open presence. And Klimek-Isinger work revealed differential neural correlates of empathy and compassion. So this affective pain reaction network versus pleasure and reward, a positive affect network. And the neural dynamics of non-referential compassion arising as a naturally affective expression of non-dual mindfulness as construed by an innatist approach are characterized by high fluidity as indexed by high gamma amplitude in the EEG signal. So that sort of flow of experiences through our awareness. When we neither fixate on the object or identify with the subject, we can say this is indexed by high gamma amplitude. So this is implications for the dyadic work. As Klemenke-Singer research findings suggest that at least referential loving kindness or compassion can be trained in a relatively short period of time. And as we, with Francisca in Humanize, we had a webinar for the teachers where we had dyads for them to experience empathy and compassion, the difference when connecting to each other in a state of emotional contagious versus first dropping into presence, open presence, present moment awareness, and then from that state generating compassion to whoever was sharing with them. And I have done this work with the students when teaching mindfulness groups at the university. So even with a relatively little mindfulness practice, it is possible to tap into this differentiation experientially. And resting in open presence, allowing for compassion to emerge spontaneously, and may therefore further enhance the dyadic work for both the listener and speaker. And for the listener, open presence and compassion enhances the sense of connection, whilst affording protection from personal distress that can inhibit empathic response. And for the speaker, being received in the space of open presence and compassion affords an opportunity to gain a higher perspective on challenging experiences, reducing self-pity, whilst increasing acceptance, non-judgment, non-reactivity, and self-compassion. And again, I would refer here to our shared experience with Francisca of the Humanize webinar, where we did the dyadic work, differentiating empathy and compassion, and that's confirmed what I have observed in my previous groups. And it was articulated not by us, but by people partaking in this experiential experiment, as I call it. And what they shared is, as a listener, and we could actually watch it in real time, they would switch from the kind of feeling as a victim of the circumstance or the victim of the situation to starting to receive it and appraise it and to reflect on it from the point of view of what was the lesson there, what it revealed about themselves, what is the learned wisdom. So it completely shifted how they were relating to the experience that they were sharing without any prompts from the listener. It just naturally changed the dynamic of the speaker in the way that they were sharing. And of course, it felt very different to the listener. And in fact, Mathieu's feedback to Tanya, when they did that single case, sort of stepping in the dark, what the differences in neural dynamics between empathy and compassion might be, he actually was very happy to switch from generating empathic distress to compassion because empathic distress was exhausting. He said it was absolutely exhausting, whereas compassion has given him sort of renewal of energy. And if we think about the implications of it in terms of compassionate altruistic action, we know that empathy can lead to burnout. We see it in social workers and medical professionals and so on. And often the answer, particularly within medical professionals, we can see it in the doctors, is to switch from empathy or affective empathy to cognitive empathy. But a better alternative might be compassion, whereby we still relating and relatable to the other in their suffering, receiving them in their suffering, as opposed to just perspective taking and staying emotionally neutral. Yet at the same time, not affecting our own emotional state negatively that could impede our ability to take altruistic action and cloud our clarity in what would be the best altruistic action. so we can act from the wisdom of open presence, not just its loving, affective aspect. So I will leave it there, and I will invite your questions. My apologies for some rogue slides. I thought they were deleted because I didn't want to present two very similar studies. But somehow they still snuck in there. So my apologies for that.
Thank you, Elena, so much. That was an incredibly rich presentation, and you took us to a lot of different regions of research and thinking around these topics. And so I'm happy to open up the floor to anyone. Usually during these discussions, it's fairly informal, so anyone who wants to offer a comment or a thought or a question, just raise your actual hand or your virtual hand. Actually, virtual hand would be easier so we can see you at the front of the room, and then just unmute yourself when we call on you so you can just engage in a dialogue with Elena.
I think I will stop sharing the slides, but in case I need them to answer a particular question, I can always bring them back.
Great, yeah. And I know we had a couple of requests actually to receive your slides at some point, so I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share those.
I will tidy them up and send it to you for sharing.
Okay, great, great. And while people are thinking of maybe questions, I don't know if Franziska, you wanted to even just offer some of your experience or reflect back anything from what Elena was mentioning towards the end, because I know it takes a couple of minutes for folks to come forward with a question often.
Absolutely. And while we are transitioning, I have a feeling this was an absolutely rich hour. So whoever found something very interesting and exciting in Elena's talk, I invite you to take a deep stretch or maybe a deep breath if there is something you think was exciting. And then maybe another deep in and exhale just for yourself to arrive in this moment by reflecting on all of the beautiful insights and studies that Elena shared. And to me, I think what deeply resonated, and I believe it was the study about Mathieu Ricardis when you shared that, you know, staying in one's presence, like that complete presence with what is there in this moment, but then at the same time acknowledging the other's suffering and really deeply feeling one's own state of love. I think that resonated so much because for me, it was the most profound learning that I experienced in the dyad practice myself that I did over several weeks, every week with different people through Humanize and the program. And actually our dyad practice is based on 2 people and 2 questions. And the first question is about a challenging situation. And then the other person, the speaker, has 2.5 minutes. And then the second question is a sense of gratitude, a feeling of gratitude and relating it to the body. So it's this duality of holding the space for both. And I really loved, Elena, that you shared so many different studies. And I think that's what I learned in this dyad practice, that I can hold both things at the same time, like moving from this challenging emotion to the gratitude, by then still staying with my, like through the state of my own love, I was able to move through that. And I thought that was very beautiful. And I'm really curious to hear from you if maybe anyone has experience with dyad practices, with partner-based meditations. And I see Annie has a question, so feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes. Let's see. You're talking about a secular approach to great perfection. But in the Tibetan tradition, you don't get there. You start with a calm abiding meditation, and at some point you have to go through tantric practice, which is there you learn to deal with emotions. You meet the shadow, you see, and how can you access non-dual awareness without going through that, which also know in the Western tradition. So that's one thing. Well, I did practice dyadic practice in two concepts, which are not, well, first one is focusing, which is in a way, it's not presented as a meditation, not at all, but yet it's the basis of critical thinking that is well known in the Mind and Life work. The other one is short retreats in something called Enlightenment Intensive, which is based on Zen in a way, which is very powerful. We work intensively in Dyads, and we work only on the question, who am I? And I did it, I will tell you, you can get a breakthrough with that, because getting into non-dual awareness is easy. Stabilizing it is a totally different issue.
Yes, Annie, thank you for this remark. I really agree, and that's what I was articulating, that it is something that can be glimpsed relatively easy, and therefore the emphasis was on making this difference between what John Donne called the natist and cultivationist approach. So we don't come to it with this presupposition that it's unattainable, or might take even not just 10,000 hours, but many lifetimes, you know, if you take the tradition. So I totally agree. And when I talk about open presence, non-dual mindfulness, non-dual awareness, interchangeable terms, it's to provide the overall framework. It's not to suggest that, you know, anyone starting dyadic work just can get there, even though they can in theory, right? Because that's the crux of the innatist approach. But we're talking about the relative benefits to both the speaker and the listener in the dyadic work of knowing the difference, even just knowing that there is a difference between empathy and compassion, and finding through trial and error with some pointers, what does that feel like? And then, yes, of course, one requires to do deeper work to actually realize fully and stabilize completely non-dual awareness, open presence, or nature of mind. And I'm sort of seeing Amy on my screen, and I keep on thinking about the psychotherapeutic context, and I would have thought that what psychotherapeutic presence is, or psychotherapeutic space, is the same thing, really. So I just wanted for you to comment, Amy, if you could. It would be interesting just to do a study whether in fact they do feel and appear in terms of neural dynamics very similar, if not the same.
You put me in a
I put you in a bit of a spot.
In a machine, Elena. There are lots of pings when you're talking about these things, because I was thinking a little bit about the job that I do, and I was, one of the words that came to mind when I was thinking about what you were saying about non-dual awareness is that there is an experience that one has in psychotherapy, which is, and it's the participatory sense makers that have picked up on that with the good word, which is the sense of immersion. So there's this sense that you are in the middle of something. I don't always think of it in terms of some kind of non-duality, but there's probably a relationship between this notion of immersive listening and some sort of space between the subject-object divide and something that goes more towards a non-dual awareness. But I don't know.
Yeah.
Have there been studies? I mean, I don't know how you do it, because it's a question that I've often had, and I don't want to take up too much space, is that the therapeutic situation is very ritualized, and ritual is sort of not part of the, I'm sure it's somehow put into the types of dyadic experiences that are carried out at humanized, but the secular approach has kind of removed the ritual aspect, which is also a question that I often have. So, I can't just pull up that feeling as Mathieu does, but then again, I'm not Mathieu. So the ritual question is an interesting question, I think, in terms of it being a kind of a background structure, like a structure to lean on in these practices in the less secular setting. And we sort of have that in the therapeutic setting, a totally different set of parameters, but that have a ritualized aspect.
Well, I think of a ritual as a container to create a certain presence. But even without going into subject-object duality, certainly in my personal experience of being in a context of being a client in psychotherapy, there is a distinct difference between being received by a psychotherapist who has this presence, hold this presence, and holds you in this presence. And then it is a very empowering to be in that presence as a client, and very similar to what I've shared with the dyadic work that we did for a Humanize webinar, where one can disentangle from one's reactions and one's sort of victimhood on the situation, but appraise it from a much broader, higher, not cognitive perspective. It's still an emotional perspective, but it's a wisdom-led sort of perspective, so to speak, without blame and so on, but just, okay, this is what I have now. How do I process it? How do I integrate it, and so on, versus being in the presence of a therapist who feels like they are keeping it a little bit at a distance because they might be protecting themselves from the sort of the emotional resonance, which isn't the same. So really, I was kind of more interested in those phonological distinctions that might be difficult to articulate, but they're definitely palpable when one taps into the difference between them. And that sort of blurring the subject-object boundaries, someone that one might notice, are we putting that barrier, or are we allowing the presence of the other to be our presence without going to, particular in what that means to have a complete non-duality or complete dissolution of subject-object boundaries. And that I think is very attainable. Francis, do you say further?
Hi. Good to see you in this talk, and giving a lot of thought to it. I'm reading a book here that's quite remarkable, The Master and His Emissary. Do we know this?
Yes.
The Two Sides of the Brain.
Yes.
It's really pretty intense. In the Gilchrist. Now, when I was trying to process the information coming from the brain areas that were identified in compassion, empathy, self-awareness, and so forth, do you also have, or since you're reporting on other people's work, did they have first-person reports on what the subjects were thinking and feeling when those, I suppose it was fMRI or something, was being done, so that you have the area and therefore the brain set of connections, and then what was the subjective, shall we say, observation or commentary on that? Very interesting. Do you know if any of that came through in these?
There was no commentary per se that you could relate, for each trial. But there was a subjective ratings of to what extent they experienced negative or positive affect to each video, pre and post training. But I don't remember from the top of my head if the subjective ratings were presented in a graph that was on the slides, but whether they were directly correlated to brain activity, I do not remember.
You see, that would be very interesting because the verbalization or in any way of symbolization of the thought processes in response to a situation awakening empathy might be very, very valuable, from person to person. Yet there would be these set of constants in the regions of the brain. And that would in itself be a valuable study of comparison. It would help us understand, for example, the vocabulary that people use while suffering and while tending to suffering, that kind of thing. A friend of mine did some research on what people say as they go through different stages of an illness. And collected that data, just first-person reports by the hundreds, and really very, very helpful when you're trying to work with people, because they will say things that if you don't notice them, right, you won't really know what's going on. But if you notice, you will know that, now this patient is going through this stage, and that means that we're in a good place, or we better fix something. You see what I mean? So that there are actual clinical applications to some of that first person reporting. Anyway, great work. Thank you.
Well, that's not my work, thank you. And there were other pioneers of this work that provided very important distinctions. But what you're talking about is a more of a neurophysiological study, which I agree would be interesting to conduct. We still have big impediments to doing that type of research, but hopefully we will shift the paradigms soon enough to be able to incorporate those type of designs into looking at the relationship between experiential dynamics and neural dynamics. It really does require quite an overhaul of how we approach fMRI research, and we're actually moving in that direction. So with so-called precision scanning, there is a more and more recognition that it's better to understand inter and intrasubjective differences, within the same individual at different time points, like you were saying, progression over the course of the illness, how a perspective in relationship to the chronic illness might change its dynamics over time. That would have its reflection probably on all sorts of markers, immune markers, neural markers, and so on. And also variability between people. So there's more and more recognition that we really need to be looking at that rather than treating it as noise and checking it out or dealing it with in some way. Hopefully we have the same sort of revolution coming in neuroscience as we had in genetics, where so-called junk DNA, just the name, right? It was called junk DNA because scientists couldn't understand what it's doing, therefore it's junk. And now they understand that it's actually hugely related to epigenetics, how the DNA or protein synthesis response to the environmental stresses and to personal reactions and appraisal of the experience. So we're actually planning an ENSICON meeting just on that, on the paradigm shift, which we would very much like you to attend. You're on the list of the people to be invited.
Sounds good. Very good work. Thanks.
Slightly jumping ahead with that, but we're at the initial stages. But yes, but spot on, I would say. That's where we really need to be moving as with this work, particularly with this type of work.
Thank you for the Francis. I think Alban, you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself, Alban?
Yes, thank you. I will try to be brief, and thank you, Elena, for your presentation. And I wanted to have your take on this concept of compassion fatigue, because you have shown us that like there's on one way there's empathy, and we can there's this kind of negative effect on us, and we hear more and more about compassion fatigue, especially in the field of care. And I wanted to ask you what's your take on that?
The empathy fatigue and empathy burnout, I would say probably a better terms to use in relation to that, because preliminaries of trials that were conducted in teaching social workers, nurses, compassion rather than empathy showed that it's a game changer. And that was one of the important points of this differentiation, that that compassion doesn't lead to that exhaustion, because emotional distress in relation to another suffering can be quite draining. We all know that, how draining a conversation with a friend could be, that required us to empathize, right? Whereas, and this is what would be interesting to research more, that sense of vitality that comes with different way of relating. Can we capture that as a difference, not just in terms of subjective ratings of affect or neural dynamics, but how does that affect even my ability to be present with someone, right? In terms of my vitality, my readiness, my clarity to engage, be present. But yes, I suppose even with compassion, we can get fatigue, possibly, as our world is still so arranged that if we constantly, well, I don't know. I'm kind of saying this in a way to find validity in this view, but again, it depends. If it's a referential compassion, I would guess that there is still some kind of fatigue can develop, because it's still tinged with personal distress, and there is some blunting. If you remember, I made that differentiating. Whereas if one, that would require quite a lot of practice, as Annie has rightly pointed out. But if one is truly resting in open presence, with the compassion as a sort of fountain of unconditional love pouring out spontaneously, non-referentially, then it's a high energy state. And that, when it's stabilized, that should not be exhaustible or exhausting. But that's stage 4. Buddhas and enlightened individuals. Yes. We're not there yet. I'm not there yet.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Alban. We're just coming up to our time, so I just want to double check in the room if there are any other burning questions or comments or reflections you'd like to make. And no obligation, of course. So if not, Eleanor, do you want to make any final remarks, or?
I would just encourage everyone to test the difference next time you find yourself in a conversation with a friend or a loved one in the family, and sort of playing in oneself with going into emotional resonance versus going into presence and relating from the place of compassion without thinking too much. Am I at the stage of non-duality? That's not what's important. It's how we are connected to ourselves when we're connecting to the other, the quality of our presence that matters. And it can have different degrees of depth, but even when we start just dipping our toe into it, the difference is palpable. And in my experience of teaching it to others and getting their feedback on this experiential experiment, and the world would be a better place for it. If we get the hang of the difference and engage in open presence and compassion with each other more than keep on resonating in negative energy and spreading it around.
It's probably a really good place to end. On that note, thank you so much once again, Elena, for your really
inspiration
talk, and Francisca again for your partnership in organizing this and also really being integral in finding a date for this talk. We were lucky to catch Elena on one of her rare available days to offer this talk. And thank you everyone for joining this evening. Really lovely to see many of your faces back in the Zoom room. And I think we just have a couple of announcements for an upcoming talk. Actually, next week it's a public talk, so you're all encouraged, invited to attend and spread the word if you'd like. It's a different series that we have going on at Mind and Life Europe called the Mind Matters series, and we've been focusing since 2023 on the sort of conceptual figurehead of Gaia in this particular series. So we're having a really prominent historian of science and literature, Frédéric Tauti, who will be giving a talk next Wednesday. So same time, 6 p.m. Central European summertime and 5 p.m. in the UK. So feel free to look at our website to sign up to that. And we are also opening our European Varela Award cycle on the 21st of October. So for any early career researchers, I see someone is possibly interested, so that's a good sign. Any early career researchers who've attended an ESRI or an MLE retreat, we'd love to have you apply. And these are great scholarships for those who are really focusing on a neurophenomenological approach to contemplative research. Some of which Elena talked about earlier. So with that, we look forward to seeing many of you back on Zoom very soon. And thank you again to all, and have a wonderful evening or rest of your day, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.